All right, so this week we wanted to talk through getting a home ready for the market and really what are the things that I look at when we walk through homes and how we're advising our clients to be able to stand out in today's market with inventory levels that were a little bit higher than we had seen in years past. So, and when we start talking about, getting ready for market, a lot of times sellers are putting in their mind, this is going to be a lot of money. I really don't want to spend a whole bunch of money to be able to get the house ready. And I just want to sell it and move on to the next property. And we totally get it. But in this video, I wanted to focus on the top 10 things that we see that really, differentiate one property over another. And the idea that trying to keep this within a budget that is not incredibly expensive. And a lot of these things can be done, by homeowners themselves over a weekend. So let's go ahead. Let's jump into it. Hey guys, it's Bill Stewart with the Bill Stewart Homes team here in Greenville, South Carolina. And we work with home sellers all the time. And one of the first things that I like to do before we even start talking with our clients about pricing or strategy or anything else like that is I like to walk through homes. I really want to get a feel. I want to be able to see how the home looks. And at that point, kind of make some suggestions based on what we are hearing and feedback from other clients' homes and really trying to make sure that we've gotten those things buttoned up even before we start bringing anybody into the house. And a lot of these things they will seem simple and really are not all expensive to do, but they do make a big difference when buyers come in because their mind is starting to calculate, spend, what am I going to have to do? How am I going to make this work? The other is that buying a home is a very emotional experience. So we really want to make sure that we're tying into both the logic and the emotional side of the buying experience for that buyer and standing out as an obvious choice in the marketplace. One of the first things that we're looking at when I pull up to a house, obviously from the outside, I want to take a look at what the outside of the house looks like. What's the curb appeal? And at that point, I'm already starting to calculate, to make decisions. Sometimes I walk in and it's amazing and I'm like, there's nothing that needs to be done. Other times I'm looking at things where it's like the hedges have been overgrown. You've got shrubbery that's coming up and touching the house. You have tree limbs that have, over time have just grown over top of the roof. You've got if you have a vinyl siding or a brick home, you start to see where it kind of has that greenish, growth because of the fact that it's not getting direct sunlight. And so things have a tendency to grow. Pressure washing is a huge plus. It really does brighten up a home. Or things like the driveway, sidewalks, front porch, over time have just started to, the color has changed. It doesn't look as bright as possible. So, really going through and taking a look at the landscaping as a whole. How does the mulch look? Are the plants dying? Do they need to be replaced? Could you add a couple of flowers in the entranceway or in those garden beds that would at that point kind of create a more inviting environment for that buyer when they walk in? So, pressure washing is huge. We recommend that a lot of times because of the fact that you live in this house. You see it all the time. Over time, it's like our kids, as we grow up, I don't notice that my kid jumped 4 inches over the summer until I start to go back and take a look at, 6 months ago where they weren't that big. It's similar in homes. So your driveway over time starts to get kind of a darker, like either a brownish or a blackish. Same thing in your front porch. The idea that your siding over time needs to be brightened up, you're just not looking at it. But I will say, the first, when hedges and shrubs and driveways, they haven't been taken care of or they haven't been cleaned, a lot of times buyers will put that into their mind that the house itself just has not been taken care of. And that's not necessarily the case, but it's also their first impression. So we're making them sure that the first impression is a winner when they first walk in. Now, when you walk into the house, one of the first thing you're going to look at is the door handle hardware. If the door handle itself looks, is the old gold brass handle, and everything throughout the house kind of matches all throughout that. A lot of times that's going to date the house. It's going to put it, more into an 80s, maybe early 90s. And so at that point, the idea that, updating your hardware, your handles, those things are relatively easy, relatively inexpensive, but they do make a big difference when somebody walks in because of the fact that it's, it kind of shows, hey, that home seller has, has put some time and effort into keeping the home updated with the times. So I would look at your door handles. If the door handles themselves, doesn't necessarily mean that gold brass doesn't sell homes. It's just, are they clean? Are they without dents? Do they look relatively new? If not, then at that point, going and taking a look at, options, either at Lowe's, Home Depot, wherever you shop for those kinds of things. And at that point, updating them. A lot of times your front door is going to be, the front door and deadbolt could potentially be anywhere between $60 to $100 to do. The rest of the hardware through the doors depending on how many doors you have within the house to how many rooms, you could be looking at $40 or $50 like per handle. But it's those kinds of things, in my opinion, where it's not the most expensive thing in the world to do, but it does have a big bang for the buck when it comes back to what the offers look like and being able to have your house stand out. So one of the other things is going to be light fixtures. When you walk in and you see that, the idea that the light fixtures are the same builder grade bulb style, like the bowl style lighting, that they're simple. I look in bathrooms where I see it's they used to, over the vanity, they put the metal, it was the metal backing with like the 8 different incandescent round bulbs that were there. Over time, the metal back there starts to have a dinge or become rusty just because it's been in a very humid environment, being in a bathroom. Those things are a big time. Somebody walks in, they immediately know, I'm going to have to change that. I'm going to have to do this. And so instead of thinking about where their things are going to fit, they really are starting to focus on like what I'm going to have to do to make this home, to update this home. And so, the idea that those light fixtures can be sometimes, who knows, you can get a light fixture for as low as $50. As you could go even more than doing that, than that. But the reality is that it doesn't have to be an expensive light fixture, but the idea that something more simple, a little more modern really does play in. Same thing with when you walk into a dining room or into the kitchen. I see where they've got the old in kitchens where it's the old fluorescent bulbs with the white big cover. It was really popular at a time back maybe, in the mid to late 80s. It's definitely, we don't see that in new homes anymore. So the reality is like having those light fixtures replaced will go a long way. And then also in your dining room, a lot of times the chandeliers or the light fixtures themselves, you can take a look. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that all the light fixtures in the house have to be updated, but I would focus on the key areas, which would be dining room, kitchen, master bathroom, master bedroom. And then, basically what are the key areas that people are going to be living in the most, like really focusing on that. Now, another thing that we look at are ceiling fans, because I see a variety of different styles and, and also too, over time, the blades themselves start to kind of bend down. It's immediately, especially if the blades are starting to turn downward versus remaining up, it could be one of those things where it automatically starts to point that there might be a moisture problem in the house or that, and it may not be that at all. It's just the fact that over time, gravity just has a tendency to start pulling those blades down. And so at that point, that age could start to signify a couple of different things. But ceiling fans, not a super expensive thing, but it's another thing that a buyer has to come in and start thinking about. And really, when you have updated ceiling fans, it makes, I feel like it kind of ties everything all together. So really looking at your ceiling fans, I've seen a variety of different ceiling fans. In fact, we had one with a client where it was a Crayola. It had multiple colors on the blades. It was kind of dipped down. You could see where, it had a bit of damage just because of the fact that was a kid's room, so we ended up replacing that in order to go. And I think that it made a big difference. It brightened up that room, especially after they had done a couple of other things. So, light fixtures and your ceiling fans, huge, not super expensive, but do make a big difference. The other is looking at the knobs and handles in the bathrooms, kitchen. A lot of times, even if it's an older kitchen, the knobs themselves, just by replacing the knobs and pulls, will make that kitchen look a whole lot different and a whole lot better. And same thing in the master and your other bathrooms, is just updating those things. As you're doing your light fixtures, if you're updating your light fixtures in the bathrooms, in those areas, just have it be where those knobs match what that light fixture is looking like, just to kind of tie that whole room together. And again, those things are, maybe a couple dollars a piece, depending on the brand and the style that you're looking at. Not a huge expense, but do go a long way. The other is paint. I see paint all the time, and I like wear a variety of different colors, things like that. This is probably going to be one of the, if there's an expense that comes along with this, paint sometimes can be one of the biggest expenses. However, there are a lot of, it's still what I would consider a very reasonable expense, and the return on your investment in and having updated paint, I think it pays for itself tenfold. So the idea of like what color are you choosing and what styles. So on our website, we actually have a resource that goes through the different like paint colors that we feel are excellent. The other is then at that point your finishes. So, I would say from a paint perspective that, getting a home as close to white is going to make a huge impact in that, it's the most neutral. Buyers at that point, there's not going to be an argument whether or not they like the color or don't like the color. It's basically almost like a blank canvas throughout that house. I see a lot of grays. I see a lot of like blues. I see a lot of like accent walls, those kinds of things. These are all great when you're living in a house, but a lot of times, when a buyer walks in, it may not be the color that they prefer. I've seen few people that argue with white in that they can change it to whatever they want to. The other is that white goes with anything. So from a staging perspective, it's very easy to be able to match up. So if you have questions on color, like I said, on our website, I'll put a link to it. You can download it. It basically will give you, all the different paint colors that we're looking at, and sheen. Sheen is going to be, or like the finish itself of that paint. I would stay away from semi-gloss or anything too shiny. Semi-gloss is, it's great from a durability standpoint, but it shows every imperfection on the wall. Flat paint is what you see in a lot of like builders. They're using flat paint because it does a really great job of hiding imperfections. The problem is that I don't find that flat paint is super livable. And so at that point, like it's not easy to clean. My suggestion, what I use and what I suggest to clients, is that eggshell kind of gives you a flatter view. It hides a little bit more in terms of like any sort of like imperfections in the wall. Nothing's going to be perfect, but the idea that it kind of keeps it, while it also offers the ability to wipe off if anything gets on it. It has a little bit more in terms of that, but I would say paint for sure, and not just walls. You've really got to look at your baseboards as well, because at the end of it, they're going to, buyers are looking everywhere. They're really investigating. I see where we have great looking walls, but then at that point, like we didn't do the baseboards. So now you've got this beautiful white wall, but it now has that baseboard. If it's off by even a bit, at that point, like it'll stand out like a sore thumb. And nobody wants to do baseboards if they can avoid it. And so at that point, a lot of times it's like, oh, I love the house except for blah, blah, blah. And it seems like it's nitpicky. It is. It is very nitpicky. So I think that that is one of the things that, when you're looking at it, truly evaluate your paint. Paint will go a long way. It can be a pain in the butt, but it's one of those things. If you know what you're doing, you could do it yourself. If you're looking for a painter and you're unclear, feel free, reach out. We have a couple of different contacts that are very, very reasonable. We work with them quite frequently, and it can be done. It could be done over a weekend. Now, the other thing is when you're talking about paint, you're talking about light fixtures, you're talking about ceiling fans. One of the other things that we notice when we walk in is that, the face plates to your plugs, to your light switches, those kinds of things that, over time, they may have been white at one point, but over time they started to kind of, get a yellowish hue just from, whether it's sun damage or just, over time, they have a tendency to just kind of change that color. If you're going up against a stark white wall and now all of a sudden you got a faceplate that used to be white, but now it's kind of like a dingy yellow, it's going to stand out pretty quick. So faceplates themselves, really inexpensive. I would look at your plugs too. If the plugs, you've got this beautiful white faceplate, but the plug itself is now a dingy yellow, I think that it would be worth, changing out those plugs. If you know how to do it, it's very inexpensive. I would say it's more of a homeowner task, just making sure that you've got the fuse unplugged, or the actual, making sure that you go to the electrical panel and turn off the breaker to that switch. But the idea is that it's not super hard, but it does go a long way between faceplates and those things. So, I would really going through and looking at these things. Again, you're talking, not a huge expense, but they will give you a lot of mileage when it comes down to, what buyers will look at and offers, how quickly you can get an offer. When we're looking at things like carpets, I walk into carpets a lot, carpets that need to either be cleaned, stretched. Over time, you start to see that they get a ripple. Like it's just that carpet has stretched over time and it starts to build, there's a ripple effect that starts to hit in the carpet. Getting a carpet stretched, the thing that I hear all the time from buyers or from sellers, is that, well, we're not going to worry about the carpet. We'll let a buyer take care of that. I'm telling you, this is not a carpet can be the maker or breaker when it comes to how a buyer evaluates a property. Even though carpet, you could offer it in a credit, you could offer it in this. It's the idea that I don't want to have to handle it. Buyers are looking for turnkey properties, and the ones that sell quickly, as I've mentioned in other videos, the ones that sell top dollar and very quickly are homes that are turnkey, that don't require things that need to be done. So I would look at carpet stretching. It's relatively inexpensive. If you need names or contacts for vendors that can do that, feel free, reach out to us. I'll be more than happy to give you a couple of different contacts. But the other is that really, you can stretch it, then at that point, clean it. It makes a big difference when a buyer walks in, and at the end of it, even if they were going to replace the carpet at some time, it's one of those where the carpet will last. It'll give us a couple of years, and we can figure out what we want to do, whether we want to do carpet or hardwood, those kinds of things. So what you will find too is that at the end of it, they may never change that carpet, but either way, it's not our problem once the home sells. So really making sure that the carpet is a top notch. Now, if the carpet is beyond those kinds of things, it's a decision, right? If it's not, even if we clean it, it's still going to be stained. If it's going to be this, it's going to be that. You can either adjust the price accordingly to be able to figure that out, or at that point you could potentially offer the buyer credit to be able to go towards helping to replace that carpet after close. Or the idea is that we could take a look at it and say, how much would it cost to be able to repair? We're not looking to spend, we're not looking for the highest grade, quality carpet. The idea is that a lot of times carpet can be, you can take a mid-grade carpet, and as long as you put the right padding underneath it, can make it feel like, and make it look and feel like a much higher quality carpet. And at the end of it, at that point, solves the need. So it really comes down to what is the condition of the carpet? Can it be repaired? But if it needs to be stretched, if it needs to be cleaned, those are things that need to be done. We see that as carpet as a lot of times one of the biggest things that will hold a buyer back, just because of the fact that they're afraid of what the cost is going to be. When we're talking about flooring outside of carpet, if you're looking at your flooring and say you have hardwoods that are, there's chipping, or there's the varnish has come off, or things like that, I would seriously recommend having somebody come out and either refinish, repair. We've had homes where there's been a couple of different areas where they needed to be touched up. We've got a couple of really great flooring contacts that can actually match those things. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to get all the floors redone, but that you need to look at what the repair would be to be able to update that, because you want it to be seamless. You want somebody to walk in and just be wowed. And so we had one where we had, pink fingernail polish all over the floor. I was concerned that if we tried to scrape it up, that we were going to take the finish off. And the person that we had come out and take a look at it was able to not only get the fingernail polish off, but at that same point was able to do a touch a touch polish that basically matched the floor. And after he was done, it didn't even look like anything had been done to the floor whatsoever. So there are opportunities there. It really didn't cost us that much money, but if we would have left that there and had buyers look at it, immediately they would have thought that all the floors needed to be replaced. So really looking at your flooring, if there's a spot on if you have LVP, if you have hardwood, if you have tile, looking at, all of those things. And if there's something that stands out specifically, cracks, breaks, peels, anything along those lines, get those things taken care of. Again, it sounds like it's a lot of work. It sounds like it's a lot of money, but in reality, some of these things, depending on how bad the situation is, most of these that we find are minor and not very expensive whatsoever. So, when we're looking, the idea that we're trying to set a stage, making sure that the buyer there's no obstacle that buyer is going to bump into in that home, as they start to analyze to be able to put things in when it comes down to offer. The last thing, clutter. A lot of times when we walk into homes, we live there. So a lot of our clients have been in their home 3, 5, 7, 10, even longer. The longer we live in a space, the more items we have a tendency to accumulate. And I just had a client that moved. They moved from one house. It was an in-town move. When we walked in, I remember, it was an underestimation of how much stuff we actually have in our house. They filled up 2 full moving trucks with things, even after decluttering, just because of the fact that they had forgotten that they had stuff in this closet, in this space, in this area, and we just, out of sight, out of mind. You don't think about it until all of a sudden now it's like it's moving in. Well, the other is similar to like landscaping and all of the other things that we live in these spaces. And so we're not really paying attention to where it all is, and we get comfortable in our own environment. But when a buyer walks in and there's too much furniture in a room, it can make that room seem too small. And so at that point, like, even though it's a big room, if you've got 2 sectional sofas in that living room, of course it's going to make it seem like, where am I going to put my stuff? So the idea is that we're creating, a stage that will allow buyers to start to envision the idea of what their stuff is going to look like, how it goes together. And then at that point, would I be able to fit this in, a king size bed in this room? Well, if I've got too much furniture in the primary bedroom and I can't really see how that's going to go, or it feels squished with all that furniture, at that point they might potentially move somewhere else. So our recommendation a lot of times is like, get it down to the basics, like where, minimize the amount of things and stuff, whether that's in the garage, whether it's in a storage unit, the idea that, getting that stuff out and really kind of putting together building that stage to have it feel that it's not vacant. It's lived in, but that minimal is always going to work out better. And so I'll be the first to admit, I have moved more furniture to help clients get ready for photos and showings. The idea that we're, trying to make sure that we're setting that stage appropriately so that all of the work that you've put into this house, all of the time that you've put in, that you've lived in this house, you made the investment, we're really trying to pull out, and get the most out of that investment through the sale and have buyers really tie in. So they're not expensive. It sometimes can be, maybe these things don't apply to you, maybe they do, but I would say pretty much on every home we walk in, and there's at least, 3 or 4 of these 10 things that come up where it's like, if we did this, it would be the separator between us and our competition. So anyway, I hope this is helpful. If you have questions, or you're in the local area and you're looking to learn more about the vendors that we've mentioned, or interested in interviewing us to come out and evaluate the property, we'd love the opportunity. My contact information is down below. And, just everything, this market is there's a lot of inventory that's out there. We're starting to see listings pull back from the summer season, but it's still, 5, 6 different options that buyers are evaluating within a very close proximity of different homes. And so the goal is to stand out and be obvious choice in this marketplace, make buyers look at your home as the only option that they're looking for. And hopefully at that point, you also are able to generate the interest from other buyers that would come in. And therefore, at that point, putting some competition into what those bids would look like. That's our main goal. So hope you have a great week and look forward to speaking with you and talking with you soon.